Brian in Utah thinks that my usage of burden of proof is absurd. So welcome, Brian. How am I wrong?
Well, actually, it was kind of surprising considering that just a couple minutes earlier you said something that because I've watched you for so long, I can't believe I had heard you say this, that you actually made the dispositive statement that God's not real. And I thought your position, basically, since I began watching your videos and listening to your Atheist Debates series, was that you have not seen sufficient evidence to prove that there is a God. Was I misunderstanding that? Because this kind of goes back to your first caller asked a very similar question, that I feel like the statement, well, it's only a burden of proof on the person making the claim that a God exists. And I feel like all that does is it gives oxygen to people.
So if you go back to the beginning of the call, the beginning of the show, when I talked about burden of proof, I said every positive statement has a burden of proof. If you say God exists, you have adopted a burden of proof. If you say God does not exist, you've adopted a burden of proof. Colloquially, I'm fine with saying things like God's not real, because colloquially isn't a logical argument. It's talking about what we think is realistic. I not only am not convinced that a God exists, I am convinced that most of the gods that have been presented to me, in fact, do not exist for a variety of reasons. It's just that it's not my job to prove them, but the burden of proof is on those making a claim. And that's true whether you say X is true or X is false.
And that's where I think the absurdity comes in, because I feel it gives oxygen to people who have the absurdity of not ever having met a burden of proof, but because it falls under this veil of mysticism and theology and religion. Yeah. And
Brian, pause, because you're not making any sense. I'm talking about the burden of proof, and you're saying that it's absurd, and then you went off to talk about giving legs to mysticism and stuff. The burden of proof, it doesn't give a shit about the content of any statement. So mysticism is irrelevant. If you make a claim, you've adopted a burden of proof, period. I'm sorry that the foundations of logic, that we should have a default position, which is that we're not going to accept something until that burden of proof has been met. That's it. That's all there is. It doesn't give legs to mysticism.
But the colloquial thing that people use a lot of the time is that which is stated without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. I feel is too soft, and it allows the mysticism the ability to continue, despite the fact that
tough shit. Can you disprove mysticism?
No.
Then it's just too damn bad that people get to keep believing it. I'm sorry that you can't disprove it, but if you can't disprove it, then you have to fairly acknowledge that, and saying they haven't proved that it's true is the best you can do.
And I don't see what the problem is, right? It's like, you don't believe it. You just say that a reasonable person shouldn't believe things for which there is no evidence. So I don't know what.
But you go back to
what additional stuff you get from saying I've disproved this, because it's a God of the gaps thing. It's just a mysticism of the gaps thing. There's always going to be something that you can't disprove, right? And so you just sit back and you say, I'm just not going to believe things, and that's good enough for me.
Well, and I guess that's kind of where you get into this issue of. Man, I wish the words are starting to get away from me now. The problem is that then you allow people who, in any other context, should be convicted of fraud, like the expert on demons.
No. Stop, Brian. You are very confused here. Being convicted of fraud requires a demonstration that they have done something that is knowingly false. Somebody saying, I believe there's something that I cannot prove, is not fraud. I realize that you're really upset and mad that people are allowed to spout things that you don't believe, but if you can't prove them false, that's called freedom of mind, freedom of speech.
Okay. But when those beliefs lead to actions,
it doesn't matter. We have religious freedom. We have freedom of mind. I'm sorry that you're butthurt over the consequences. So am I, which is why I spent 17 plus years here trying to educate people on why they don't have a good reason. But you cannot, out of frustration for the consequences, suggest that they should be convicted of fraud or that somebody's got the burden of proof wrong.
No, not necessarily for the belief on it. People manipulating others for fraudulent purposes.
I'm done talking about this, Brian. I don't know how else to explain it. You are allowed to freely speak what you believe to be true. If it turns out to be manipulative, that sucks. But you don't get, what is your solution? Here, let's do it that way. Brian, what is your solution to people preaching a gospel they believe to be true, which you think causes harm? What's your solution?
No, so there's a difference between preaching the gospel versus I'm an expert in demons and exorcisms, and I can make this person well. Whoops, they died. That was me expressing my religious belief.
What is your solution? I didn't ask you to describe a scenario. I'm well versed in all the scenarios. What's your solution?
These people can't claim to be experts, especially.
What is your fucking solution?
The potential. Let's see. How can I believe? Services that can be provided that may cause medical harm have to have more than a religious basis to be performed.
What is your fucking solution? Quit describing
Brian,
problems and describe a solution.
Are you suggesting like some sort of government regulation of like practitioners of particular procedures?
Yeah, and that's one of those things that I don't understand how that falls, even especially in a country that's so litigious, that somehow manages to constantly wriggle away from that kind of scrutiny.
Because you have to demonstrate that the claim isn't true. What is your solution, Brian? Stop telling me what you think problems are. What's the solution?
It's just what he was describing, regulation that these people can be held accountable when they actually cause harm.
But you can regulate the actions. You can't regulate the beliefs, right? You can say, I don't care what you believe. You're not allowed to do you're not allowed to cut into someone because you believe that they have a demon and you have to remove it, right? Like that's not good enough. So you could probably set up some regulations around who can actually do procedures that might hurt someone, right? It's like the same. We were talking on Truth Wanted about conversion therapy and how in Canada they have now said that those sorts of activities are now illegal, and so you can regulate the behaviors and the activities, but you can't regulate the beliefs. And we're getting very far afield of anything that has to do with burden of proof here.
And so, excuse me. So, and I guess that's kind of more of what I was driving at, because the burden of proof it always seems to be on always seems to give a get out of jail free card to the mystics.
Tough shit.
Their position.
Tough shit. I'm sorry that the burden of proof doesn't work the way you think it is, but that doesn't mean I'm wrong about it. The burden of proof is what it is. Yes, the world sucks. Some people are going to do things on behalf of beliefs that are false that are going to harm other people. We can legislate some of it, but we can't legislate away the beliefs. And it doesn't have anything to do with where the burden of proof is. If you want to say, hey, people shouldn't be allowed to do exorcisms that are forced, where they're going to tie somebody down and do all this. I'm with you. And so is the law, by the way. You can't confine someone against their will.
I guess
that has nothing to do with the beliefs of the people, right? And nothing to do with the burden of proof that they would take on. It has everything to do with
that's my frustration with this call, Brian, is because you called in to suggest that I have an absurd understanding of burden of proof, when the reality is you're just
not an absurd.
Literally, it says the definition for burden of proof that Matt uses is absurd. Did you not tell that to the call screener?
No, there is a slight that's a typo. Not that your definition.
That's a typo. Let me ask the call screener if you actually use the word absurd.
Yes, I used the word absurd, but there was a.
Okay, then why are you lying to me now? Goodbye, Brian. If you call in,
I get his frustration. I get his frustration with this, and you want to shake people and say, like, well, how can you believe this? You should have a good reason to believe it. But some people just don't have that as their epistemological foundation, right? Some people think that they can believe whatever they feel like believing or whatever makes them happy or any of these other things, and they just don't. They haven't bought into the concept that you as a person should have a reason to believe a thing before you believe it.
See, when you call in to suggest that I have an absurd understanding of burden of proof, and your real argument is you think it's unfortunate that you cannot stop people from doing things because of the way the burden of proof works, and then you lie about it, you're no longer welcome. If you want to claim that I'm wrong about the burden of proof, you have a case to make. If you want to claim that my view is absurd, you have a case to make. But if your case is, it seems to allow people to continue to believe things and do things that aren't potentially true, yes, that's freedom of mind, that's freedom of speech, that's freedom of thought. Unfortunately, you are not going to be the guardian, Brian, of who is and isn't allowed to practice what they believe. Who watches the watchers? There's a reason why we have the burden of proof the way it is. But when I point out that a call screener typed in what you said and you try to duck and dodge and say you didn't and then admit you did, come on. Just get to the realization, Brian, that you are frustrated, and rightfully so. It absolutely sucks that people are going to be harmed because of other people's beliefs. And we can and do legislate some of that, but you're not going to stop it all. That's why I was like, what's your solution? Here's a problem. What's the solution? Well, the solution never was and never will be, we need to change the burden of proof. Because when you do that, the
solution is you have to convince people to care about good reasons to believe things, right? But it's a persuasive argument. It's not something you can force on someone. You have to persuade someone that it's in their best interest to only believe things that are well-founded.